Wait a minute. This isn't legal. There's no seal on it. Where's the seal?
Where's the seal?
Where's the seal?
Where's the seal?
Where's the seal? Where's the seal?
It's the Marx Brothers Council Podcast, episode 72. What if? Good day to you, Marx Maniacs. This is Noah Diamond, coming to you through the courtesy of the enemy. Matthew Conium is away this month, dealing with some personal matters, but he will be back with us next time. In the meantime, my co-host is a young fella just getting his start in this business. Please welcome Bob Gassell. Hello, Bob.
We have finally declared independence from our UK rule, and I am so thrilled to be able to do this without fear of repression or tyranny.
It's so nice. It's a purely domestic podcast this month, not our usual international panel. Your day job has been busy lately, Bob, because of the Olympics.
Yeah. For those who don't know, I do some editing for NBC Sports in Stamford, Connecticut, about 20 minutes from my home. I was working on the Paris Olympics, and they put me on a shift that I was on for 3 straight weeks with no days off. It was 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. Now, I've done this overnight shift before, and I was able to get my body clock adjusted and actually handled the assignment pretty easily. But since the Olympics have been over, I've been unable to get my body clock and sleep schedule back onto a normal rhythm, and so I am dealing with an extreme case of insomnia recently. So I might sound a little loopier than normal.
Wow, it's like you have to have Olympian-level endurance just to edit the Olympics, don't you?
Exactly.
Well, Bob, this is one of those episodes where we have a truly great guest, in contrast with all our episodes with lousy guests. This one is an author, editor, and cultural historian, perhaps best known for his 2 decades with Marvel Comics, where he served as editor and sometime writer of the Spider-Man titles during that crucial period when I was reading them. His other work in the comics biz at Marvel and elsewhere includes writing and editing many, many titles, including Darkhawk, Daredevil, Dazzler, and some which do not begin with the letter D, like Avengers, Iron Man, Fantastic Four, and What If. He has taught at institutions including New York University and the New School, created and moderated countless symposia for the Museum of Comic and Cartoon Art, various Comic-Cons, literary festivals, and much more. And more recently, he is the acclaimed author of several great books, including Superman on the Couch, Disguised as Clark Kent, Jews, Comics, and the Creation of the Superhero, and 2 excellent biographies, A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee, published by St. Martin's Press in 2019, and Jack Ruby, The Many Faces of Oswald's Assassin, from Chicago Review Press.
Wait, wasn't Jack Ruby Stan Lee's partner?
No, he worked with Burt Kalmar.
Oh, I must be thinking of Jack Kirby.
In the world of the Marx Brothers, our guest has collaborated with me on an ongoing exploration of the connection between the Marx Brothers and Jewish identity. Together, he and I spoke about the Marxes for the recent online class, Is Anything Okay? The History of Jews and Comedy in America, presented by the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. We also worked together on the recent Marxfest panel, Did Someone Call Me Schnorrer? The Marx Brothers and Jewish Identity, as well as the Gabe Kaplan event at Marxfest. Coming up next for us is an online Marx Brothers panel for the Jewish Study Center. We've been on for a while. I haven't even said his name yet. Please welcome my friend, the amazing, the spectacular, your friendly neighborhood, Danny Fingeroth.
Well, thank you. I don't know how I can live up to that introduction, because you took all my highly inflated self-written biographies from various places on the internet and inflated them even more. So it was a fantasy of mine to be on the Marx Brothers Council, but I always thought, well, yes, of course, I'm familiar with the Marx Brothers, and And my Marx Brothers status, at least in my own mind, was elevated by appearing at those two events at the festival. But I'm not subtle when I want somebody to invite me on a show or to a convention. I'm not subtle about it. But I did not even feel that I was even approaching Marx Brothers Council level guests. So when you sent me the invitation by email, I think my response was, "You had me at Dear Danny." I mean, that was just like, so it's great. It's wonderful to be here, and this really is a case of not wanting to belong to any club that would have someone like me as a member. I truly feel not worthy. So now that I've hopefully lowered expectations among the listeners.
I got to tell you, I spent a long time looking up for some type of connection between Jack Ruby and the Marx Brothers. And other than being Jewish and having some Chicago connection, I really wasn't able to find much. The only thing that came up in my Google searches was that the Dallas Police Department handling of Lee Harvey Oswald was like something out of a Marx Brothers movie.
Well, I mean, I think one connection would actually be Gabe Kaplan, who we'll talk about. And in some weird way, although Ruby was connected. Well, was a dangerous word with the Jack Ruby story, the word connected. Jack Ruby was in show business, and he was in, I think there was nothing that made Jack Ruby happier than standing in front of his audience at the Carousel Club and telling jokes. I mean, it was that. So that's maybe the connection.
Yeah. Do you want to talk? We have our Marx Brothers questions for you, and we'll get to them. But since you've opened the door to it, do you want to talk about the Gabe Kaplan Jack Ruby connection now?
Sure.
It's a good story, and it is Marx adjacent.
Well, it's an amazing story on so many levels. But I did, just in case all of us forget, the paperback of Jack Ruby is coming out October 1st. I'm doing a lot of events, including one in Fairfax, Virginia, and Washington, D.C., and a bunch in the New York area. So maybe you guys can post some of those or something.
Happy to. Yeah, check our website, MarxBrothersCouncilPodcast.com, listeners, for links to some of Danny's upcoming stuff.
Thank you. Yes, and I'm actually going to put it up on my own website, which I spent a lot of money having somebody refurbish, and then I'll still let it gain tumbleweed. Jack Ruby, for the three people who don't know, Jack Ruby is the guy in the famous photo who murders Lee Harvey Oswald on live television. There's a famous photo of it, but that was probably the first murder anybody ever saw on live TV, and of course it birthed 1,000 conspiracy theories and some comedy routines, including Lenny Bruce and other people in the era. But it was just the opening shot, if you'll pardon the expression, of a lot of stuff that we take for granted. So I, for various reasons, I wrote a book about Jack Ruby. It started as a graphic novel project, which I was doing with a guy named Rick Geary. Some of you may know his art. Terrific artist, a lot of true crime, true murder stuff. Put it on the back burner as a graphic novel, then revived it a couple of years ago, and my agent was able to sell it as a prose biography, especially in the wake of my other books, including the Stanley biography. A great story that I recount in the book is I heard Gabe Kaplan from Welcome Back, Kotter, and Celebrity Poker and celebrity sports events, celebrity sports competitions, also known very well as a Groucho fan and Groucho impersonator and playing Groucho in what was the name of the show?
Life in Review. Groucho
Life in Review. Written by Groucho's son, Arthur. So there's a story that Gabe Kaplan told on Gilbert Gottfried's podcast, maybe a couple of other places, about auditioning for Jack Ruby. And it's like Kaplan uses a very mild, not even call it an obscenity is ridiculous. He uses the word tits in a routine where he says that it's about Dracula, how the joke was that Dracula would be more interested in a woman's neck than in her quote unquote tits. And Ruby goes nuts. He hits the ceiling. What do you want to get me shut down? This is, you can't use that. And it's a great story. And I recount it in the book. And I'm very careful to give both Gabe and Gilbert and Frank Santopadre, who is Gilbert's co-host and producer, everybody credit. And then I'm doing an event in Dallas on November 21st, the day before the anniversary, or maybe the 20th, the day or two before the anniversary. I'm in Dallas doing an event co-sponsored by the Dallas Jewish Historical Society and the Sixth Floor Museum, which is the former book depository. And there's a guy in the audience who looks familiar, but it's a room full of old Jews. Everybody looks familiar. So there I am. I'm showing Gabe Kaplan's picture from the Cotter days. I'm telling his story. Fine. It goes very well. I'm signing books. And as I'm sitting down to sign books, a guy comes up, and it's that guy. And I say, well, who should I make it out to? And he says, you can just make it out to Gabe. And I go, you're Gabe Kaplan, aren't you? You were just sitting in the audience while I told your story and showed your picture. How embarrassed am I? But obviously he was fine with it, and we actually went out to dinner afterwards, which is another whole story that is even more of a digression from Groucho. But I've been in fairly regular touch with Mr. Kaplan, and when Noah and I were talking about my participating in the Marxfest, I think I said, well, wouldn't it be crazy if we could get Gabe Kaplan to do an interview? And it turned out the reason Gabe Kaplan was in Dallas was because he lives part-time in Dallas for a number of reasons. So it's not that he came to see Danny Fingeroth. A friend of his told him, hey, this guy is talking about Jack Ruby. Maybe you'd be interested. That's why he showed up in the first place. So I thought, well, let me stretch the boundaries of my new relationship with a celebrity and see if he'd be willing to do an interview about Groucho and whatever else we want to talk about. And obviously, after much schnorring, we were able to get him to agree to do it. And so that became the interview that was for a packed house at the Marxfest. And he couldn't have been nicer and funnier. And we're trying to see if you guys can use it for the Marx Brothers Council, which requires a whole new level of schnorring by me of Gabe Kaplan to see if he will allow us to do it. But yeah.
Well, let me get a hold of Travolta, and maybe he could help move things along. Okay.
See what you can do.
Yeah, it was a terrific event and a great interview. Gabe was an incredible subject, and Danny was a great moderator. And yes, listeners, we are still hoping to bring you some of that event in a future episode.
I think with all of us, I mean, things we do that we're passionate about, they're always connected in some way, shape, or form, and probably goes back to something in childhood. Certainly the Marx Brothers connection for me. It's not that big a stretch to connect Jack Ruby to the Marx Brothers, to Stan Lee.
Let's just say that we should be thankful that Jack didn't have his gun handy when Gabe made that dirty joke.
Actually, he probably did.
Well, let's connect Danny Fingeroth and the Marx Brothers. You probably know this, Danny. When we have new guests on the podcast, we usually start off with their origin stories. Where and when? How did you first encounter the Marx Brothers? What about them grabbed you, and what are your earliest memories of them?
The Marx Brothers just were always there. Local New York TV. I grew up 2 blocks from where the Marx Brothers lived in Yorkville and Manhattan. But I didn't know that at the time, obviously, because there was no sign on the building or anything.
Yeah. We'll do an episode on that too someday.
Is there one yet? Did they?
There's not a sign on the building, but there is one right here. Our listeners can't see, but I am holding it up right now. It says "Childhood Home of the Marx Brothers, 1895 to 1908." It's a beautiful looking sign. It's just in the wrong place. In other words, it's in my apartment.
You can't get the building owners to agree to put it up?
Well, it's complicated. We did at one point get sort of permission to put it up, but it didn't quite happen for numerous reasons. In a nutshell, it's that putting up an unofficial sign would create a sense of mission accomplished. When really a sign isn't landmark status and doesn't protect the building.
Right.
The people who care about the building really want landmark status, which may just be out of reach in this case, but their concern is that if we just put a sign on the building, we'll all say, hey, we got it done.
We did it, yeah.
And then someone will buy and demolish the building.
I have a feeling that building has been remodeled. The outside has been remodeled.
It has.
Yeah. So probably that's part of the problem with the landmark status, I would imagine.
That's right. It has changed a lot.
So somebody has to redo it to make it go back to looking like it did in 1900. Anyway, on local New York TV, you would just they would have things like what's called the $1 Million Movie, and just there was certain movies were always on. Now, clearly, there was somebody in my family. I'm the youngest by far of three sons, actually, and no daughters. So I think that
Me too.
maybe part of so that's what you and me, Bob, and the Corleones, although there was and the Marxes have in common. There was a sister in the Corleone family. So they were just always there, and something about them just grabbed me. And I think in a way different than the Three Stooges or Abbott and Costello, which were also part of the kind of the black and white world of comedy that a kid would watch in the 50s and 60s. And then I guess there was also You Bet Your Life was on. Again, I don't know if as a child, I don't know if I put it together that this is the same guy, that the guy with the grease paint mustache in the movies was the same witty guy. But I think I was just reading Adam Gopnik's article, one of his articles about the Marx Brothers. Groucho especially was a very familiar type. He was a smart-ass, New York-born, child of immigrants, Jewish guy who smoked a cigar like my father, and a lot of people of that generation smoked cigars. That a cigar was not just a comedian's prop; it was I think every American man, but certainly like every Jewish New York guy who wanted to. It was a great prop, I mean, that's. I think that's why everybody starts smoking. Nobody start. Oh, I'd love to have a substance to get addicted to. How about tobacco? No, it's like, wow, it looks really cool. Smoke comes out of your mouth. Jesus. I mean, and it's just a great way to punctuate a point, to make a punchline, to emphasize something. And I suppose there's something of a phallic nature about it, but sometimes, as that other comedy scholar Freud didn't say, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, but there was something very familiar about, and they were funny. I mean, they were just very, very funny in a way that seemed modern. I think that's really an important thing. I think that may have worn off. I think when a kid today looks at the Marx Brothers, especially if it's black and white, they seem antiquated. But something, they did not seem old-fashioned. It didn't seem like I was, say, even in the early 60s or late 50s, didn't seem like I was looking at a window into a previous era, especially Groucho. But all the brothers just seemed really modern. It didn't feel the way like watching Laurel and Hardy or Chaplin. It's funny. Buster Keaton retains an air of modernity that like the Marx Brothers. There's something, like I said, I think popular culture and media and technology has moved so far that just to look at a movie in that traditional 3-to-2 aspect ratio, and and then moves at that pace. I think we may have gone past that, but when I was a kid and a teenager, that was the great thing about the Marxists, and maybe about the W.C. Fields and Keaton, that they seemed timeless, but they also seemed of the modern era. Although we knew they had this heritage, so it's like when somebody says, "What was my first comic book?" or a lot of things that just were there and they were familiar. And then certainly in the 70s when I was in college, there must have been there were a lot of people of my generations. I guess Stephen Stollier is one of the most prominent, who made it a point of getting the movies, seeing them on the big screen as opposed to on TV, so you'd have a context for them in a movie theater, and then really starting this scholarship of the Marx Brothers. And I was a film student and a film buff, or whatever you want to call it, so the history of film. And, we had, without knowing it, this is a very long answer, isn't it? We had, without knowing it, we had the variety shows of the 50s and 60s were really vehicles for lessons in the history of vaudeville. Again, as a kid, I had no context for it, but, okay, before the Ed Sullivan Show existed, these guys were touring the country in vaudeville, before the Jack Benny Show, because they would always joke about vaudeville. Remember the Burns and Allen Show, which was bizarrely modern and surreal, and that whole concept of George Burns having closed circuit TVs to spy on his family is,
yes.
I mean, it's very disturbing, but very modern and science fiction. It really was a science fiction element of the Burns and Allen Show.
Yeah.
So and he especially would make jokes about vaudeville, and how he would, the running joke with him was he had a terrible voice and he had no real talent. That Gracie was the real talent, But I was getting an education in this, and then I guess the Sullivan Show was really maybe the Hollywood Palace, but and of course the Tonight Show, and whatever short-lived competitors came up against it. So it'd be like if a 20-something person watches Bob Dylan, love him or hate him, they know that he's somebody from an era. I mean, if the Marx Brothers movies came out in the 30s and I'm in the 50s, there's actually a much longer gap between, say, Dylan's or the Beatles' first flush of fame and now. I mean, this of course we live in the era of the internet and cable television, and so all these different eras mushed together into one. I always find it hilarious talking to a young person what they know and what they don't know, and it's almost arbitrary. Of the 100 years we've had, recordings of various kinds of entertainers and politicians and scholars. It's so funny, to hear what people go, yeah, everybody knows that, and then somebody who may have been as popular in their heyday as the person they know, I never heard of that. So I don't know my first Marx Brothers. I just know they were always there. They were always in my consciousness.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I mean, and the Marx Brothers as a kind of perpetual presence is, in a way, that supports a lot of what we've had to say about them over the years. Even more so than, yes, my first encounter, it was June 3rd, I was 9 years old. They've always been there. They've been in the oxygen, or in the ether. Well, as you know, listeners, one of the Marvel comics to bear the Fingeroth name was an anthology series from Marvel that started publication in the late 70s and was published, I think, sporadically in the 80s and 90s, was called What If? What If was an anthology series that would propose variants on the accepted Marvel universe. An issue of What If would contain a standalone story with a title like, "What if Spider-Man had stopped the burglar who killed his uncle?" Or, "What if the Submariner had married the Invisible Girl?" And the story would be a fascinating sort of alternate reality from the Marvel Universe. This is an early take on what we would now call a multiverse. What if we would take the old Marvel Comics what if idea that Danny worked on and applied it to the Marx Brothers? And what if we asked several what if questions about the life, times, and work of our favorite comedy team? I ask you, fellas, what if?
What If actually was a regular series in the 80s and 90s as well as in the 70s. And I wrote a whole bunch of them. And, they have something in common, I think, in a way with Give Me a Thrill, with the book, with Noah's book, Give Me a Thrill. To write an issue of What If, you have to be familiar with the entire continuity of the character. And then, DC Comics had what used to be called imaginary stories, as if all their stories were.
Right, as opposed to the real stories.
What if Superman had married Lois Lane? Or what if Kal-El's space capsule had landed in Soviet Russia? Or, there would be all those. And I think Marvel, we had, we wanted to distinguish ourselves from mere speculation. And so the conceit was that What If was usually based on a character making a different decision than they had made, which was challenging, because in theory, right, if you're writing fiction and a character makes a decision, it's because everything you have built and established about that character would lead them to making one and only one decision. But right there, but it requires a, dare I say, Talmudic level of study and focus and concentration, because you have to know the characters, and very often, say, if there would be a popular storyline that had at Marvel, then of course you'd want to do a What If based on that popular storyline, as well as going back to, say, the origins. But I worked hard on those What Ifs, and they were fun to do. And there's a way when you write about history or biography or people that they kind of become fictional characters, right? The idea that we don't refer, like, at least we refer to the Marx Brothers by their chosen nicknames.
Right.
We don't refer to them as their character names from the movie. So I guess they remain real people in that sense. But there is a certain level on which that the world of the Marx Brothers movies becomes a kind of Marvel Universe type of continuity, if you want to look at it that way.
Yeah, there is that. And we did a recent bonus segment called the Marx Brothers Cinematic Universe that did explore that possibility of the fictional world of their films being one unified reality.
Should we maybe just get into a couple?
Yeah, let's get into it. You want to start us off, Danny? What's the first what if on your Marx Brothers list?
The one that just keeps speaking to me is, what if Groucho had gone to medical school and become a doctor? If only because I had at least one doctor who could have been Groucho. I had an eye doctor. Yeah, and you're looking back, he had a big bushy mustache, and we used to love making fun of him, not because he was. I mean, I guess he was comedic, but he just said those things that eye doctors always say. But when you're a kid, it's brand new. Mm-hmm. I mean, an eye doctor asks what really is the most profound question, which is, better now or better now? I don't know. It all looks the same to me.
Yeah.
Do I have to make a value judgment to everything? So I guess thinking of Groucho and how much of a bookworm he was, and that he really did. That doesn't strike me as like just sort of a pat show business answer, like, oh yeah, I could have been a doctor. It does strike me.
Where exactly did he say he wished he had been a doctor? Did he say that somewhere?
He definitely, I think he wrote it in Groucho and Me. It's a thing he said. Noah, back me up here. Did he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's in Groucho and Me, but yeah, he certainly did say that anyway, that being a doctor was a job that appealed to him before he realized.
Maybe finishing grammar school first might have been a a start. Yeah.
Well, I mean, say he had that guy, the story that he would tell about I think that a lawyer he grew up with, and that guy was definitely somebody he had disdain for. That the guy said, Groucho,
clowning is all right, but you ought to find a serious career.
Yeah. But
Like Lennon with a guitar. He'll never make money doing that.
right,
Yeah.
and I think Groucho was from that generation of first generation American-born children of Eastern European Jewish immigrants. Now, Groucho, perhaps like some members of my family, might not have gotten to be a doctor. There were Jewish quotas in medical schools, and so I think that's why a lot of people of that generation became dentists, because they could not get into medical school, but they could get into dental school. I think that was the case with at least one of my uncles, who was, not that much. As we figured out, my father and his siblings were of Zeppo's generation. And Zeppo was like 17 years younger than Groucho or something.
Yeah, 1901.
So only 11 years.
11 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
Here's a related set of questions, perhaps. Let me ask you the first what if on my list, because it takes us to the same part of the world. I was thinking, what if Sam and Minnie Marx had 5 girls instead of 5 boys?
Well, I'll tell you, Go West would have been a lot better.
Good point. What would have been different? I mean, it seems to me, there were sister acts in vaudeville just as there were brother acts. There's no reason to think the Marx sisters might not have wound up being a comedy team, although the circumstances would have been different.
Were there any sister act comedy teams?
Well,
we have no idea how protective Minnie might have been of girls. We have nothing to tell us whether she would have been very protective or let them go out on their own or just forbid them from being in show business or whatever. We have nothing to base any guess on.
Yeah.
Like imagine, say, Martha Ray, Lucille Ball,
Carol Burnett,
Ethel Merman.
Yeah, Gracie Allen, Imogene Coca. It's conceivable, and even if maybe it didn't happen, because there were always many fewer opportunities for women to do anything. There aren't that many female comedians in vaudeville, period. But theoretically it could have happened. And yes, I'm sure Minnie would have had a more protective attitude toward her daughters than she had toward her sons. But on the other hand, Minnie didn't have a particularly, cobwebbed, old-fashioned idea about what women should do. Minnie herself was rather a pioneer, this businesswoman, also really kind of the head of the household for all intents and purposes.
They might not have moved to Chicago. They certainly wouldn't have had to go out and move to the farm to avoid the draft.
Oh, that's true. But it still would have been advantageous to be closer to the center of the country for vaudeville bookings. But you're right, the draft wouldn't have been an issue.
I guess Minnie, being a woman of the 19th century, her goal may have been just to get the daughters married, as opposed to sending them out in show business.
Possibly, yeah.
It's funny, I can't think of a single female comedy team
in vaudeville. I can think of Thelma Todd and Zasu Pitts, things like that in film.
Did they make films regularly together?
Yeah.
Hal Roach set them up to be like a female Laurel and Hardy, and they lasted a couple of years.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
But it's true, there's certainly not as many examples. Well, I could picture it, the Marx sisters. Maybe that'll be the subject of a future postcard.
Are we all missing an obvious female comedy, act like that?
I'm sure people who are more knowledgeable, vaudeville scholars would be able to name some female comedians whose names aren't occurring to us. But comedy teams, I don't know. There probably were eccentric dance acts that were on the border of being comedians.
Can I get to mine now?
Yeah, please.
Okay, I'm going to go my first one here. What if the coconuts their first movie had been a total bomb, where do you think their career would have headed? Would they have made another film? Would they have just gone back to Broadway? What would have happened?
Well, how big a success was it? Was it a huge success?
Yes,
Or
absolutely.
Yeah. It was a big success, and I suppose, I mean, there's always the possibility if it had been a big bomb, they just wouldn't have been given the opportunity to make Animal Crackers, and they would have had to spend the rest of their career, just going back to being a stage act. But it's also possible, because Animal Crackers already existed as a theatrical property, maybe it would have been worth trying again. In which case it might not have had a giant effect to have had a first film that wasn't successful. And
Maybe Paramount would have said, okay, we did it your way with the grease paint in New York, but no, if you're doing another film, we're bringing you out to California and you're growing a real mustache.
you're going to grow a mustache, goddammit.
who was the champion of that movie, of that film? Who was the one? Who were the one or two indispensable people to getting Coconuts made?
Well, Chico is probably, Chico certainly, and Walter Wanger, is that how you say his name? Wanger? A Paramount executive who signed the Marx Brothers. Because they were the hottest, they were hot Broadway stars at the time. It was an obvious thing to sign them up to make a movie.
And that was 2 years after the Jazz Singer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Yeah.
What came between the Jazz Singer and Coconuts? Anything?
I think Glorifying the American Girl is one.
Everybody is tapping their toes to those songs. Was there anything? Was there a big musical hit between Jazz Singer?
Well, Coconuts was the first full-length, all-talkie musical.
Certainly, we know that when the Coconuts was completed, the Marx Brothers didn't want it released. They thought it was going to be a flop and a disaster and an embarrassment. And they wanted it to, like Humor-esque, just to not ever see the light of day.
Dump it in a bathtub.
Yeah, so we could ask, what if their wishes had been...
Was it popular in small towns and cities, or was it a big urban thing?
It seemed like it was popular everywhere. The first couple seemed like they're very popular everywhere, small town, big city, everywhere. Then as they got towards in the monkey business, Horse Feathers, it seemed to have more of an urban appeal.
But somewhat surprisingly, late into their career, well into the 30s and 40s, the press was still talking about Coconuts as though it had been their best. Sometimes the Marx Brothers managed to recapture the magic of their very first movie, Coconuts. And I think it was because it was a synchronized musical comedy film.
Yeah,
it was just overwhelming to people just to hear it. So what's the next what if on your list, Danny?
What if Ted Healy, instead of championing the Three Stooges, had somehow ended up having the Marx Brothers under contract to him? How would that have affected comedy history? I don't know the answer, but Healy was famous. Mm-hmm. I see Healy, and you guys are much more well versed in this. I see Healy playing a similar role with the Marxes as Al Sheen did. Healy playing a similar role with the Stooges as
Are you talking about on screen or just as shepherding them in the
whichever
film?
way you want to take it? I'm whatever gets the funnier answer.
Well, on screen, I guess. I don't know. The only thing I could think of is they'd have to be doing more stuff along the lines like in Monkey Business, where Groucho and Zeppo were sort of stooging under Alky Briggs, running around with the gun and everything. I don't know. I can't imagine that lasting for any length of time, or them rocketing to stardom, doing stuff other than what they did, which was very refreshing, giving it to the man or whatever, or being outrageous. If they were just bumbling amongst themselves, I can't imagine them being better than the Stooges doing that.
Were they about the same ages, though, as the Marxes?
I think the Marxes were about 10 years older on average.
You don't see Groucho poking Chico in the...
That's hard to...
Oh, I bet Chico would have had no problem with it had the money been there.
But I think the idea that the Three Stooges or the Stooges originate as literally as stooges to Ted Healy in the act, and therefore they developed characters that lent themselves well to that, to being the Stooges, being fools in someone else's act. It's hard to imagine the Marx Brothers serving that kind of purpose based on the characters we know them to have developed. Maybe it's a little easier to imagine Harpo and Chico in that kind of position than Groucho, but it's still not quite, particularly with Harpo. On the other hand, if the Marx Brothers had gotten their start as stooges in someone else's act, maybe their characters would have developed more along stooge lines.
Now, there's a big stooge connection, a comic book connection that the Marxes never had.
That the Stooges had a comic book.
One of my favorite photos that I've ever seen in my life. Not even something, it's not a particularly good photo. Just this photo exists. It's a picture of Erwin Hazen, the artist of Gandhi and of the Green Lantern. But he was one of the golden age artists I got to know thanks to modern medical science. Science kept Erwin alive long enough for me to meet him and to spend time with him. But Erwin was friends with Joe Kubert, and Joe Kubert was business partners with Norman Maurer, who directed a lot of the Stooge movies and was a comic book artist. And there's a picture of Erwin, and Joe Kubert was famous for Sergeant Rock, and then later on for doing graphic novels and for starting and running a comic art school. There's a picture of Erwin Hazen and Joe Kubert, like in a convertible, on the way to California to go to Norman Maurer's marriage to Mo Howard's daughter. So the Stooges were very connected to comic book royalty, and that's why there were Three Stooges comics that Norman Maurer created and wrote and drew. But there's just there's the Stooges connection to comic books is always intriguing, and the fact that, just to say, here's a picture of two guys on the way to Norman Maurer's wedding at Mo Howard's house in L.A.
All I could say is that when you think about it, are there any comedians less suited for the comic book than the Three Stooges?
Right, so physical, you mean?
Yeah.
Although if you think of an era when comics were aimed at children, we certainly had a lot of juvenile and childlike stuff that was translated well. I guess the reason that they ended up in comics in the 50s and 60s was because their reruns were on all the time.
Yeah.
For my generation, for the baby boom generation. And they were putting out, the Stooges were putting out new movies into the 60s.
Yeah. I mean, they became late in their career. They became a family kids act, but they certainly weren't that at their peak, in the late 30s, early 40s. I think the children were not the target audience. Noah, let's hear your next one.
Here's my second what if. What if Harpo had not stopped speaking on stage?
You would have been kicked out of the act?
What was the official reason that he stopped speaking?
He stopped speaking because he wasn't good at it. He was bad at speaking on stage. He had a stammer. He didn't have a good voice for the stage. And when Al Sheen wrote Home Again, he wrote little or no material for Harpo, and Harpo was distressed about that. And Sheen's response was something along the lines of, it's better if you don't talk too much. And so Harpo developed his skill as a non-speaking comedian because he wasn't good at talking on stage. Now, I think...
Yes.
Now, we know that when he was speaking on stage, in the schoolroom act, he was given an Irish character to play. Patsy Bolivar or Patsy Brannigan in some sources. That's why the red wig. So it's possible that if he had not stopped speaking on stage, maybe he would have kept the Irish character the same way Chico kept the Italian character. I think his comic skills still would have been his comic skills, so he still probably would have been close to the character we know, but maybe he would have had some Irish patter, probably no more convincing than Chico's Italian patter, but maybe it would have been just as distinctive. And if he had had to keep doing it, maybe he would have gotten better at it over the years. He was a comic genius, and he might have figured it out.
I usually refer to sort of the early 20th century New York ethnic groups as the Godfather mix, the Irish, the Italians, and the Jews. But I guess had he stayed as Patsy Brannigan, maybe people like me would think of it as the Marx Brothers mix. One of my what ifs that I didn't write down because I couldn't quite figure out how to formulate it as a question was, what if the Corleone brothers and the Marx Brothers switched places in American culture somehow?
Wow. Wow, I'm going to have to take a little time with that, Danny. With
Marlon Brando as Al Sheen, I guess.
My next what if is somewhat along those lines. In 1938 or early 1939, there was a little newspaper blurb, not totally in jest, suggesting that perhaps someone was interested in putting the Marx Brothers into the soon-to-be produced Wizard of Oz. And how would that have gone? Who would have been what? Could that have worked?
Could have.
Yeah, that's a great thing to think about, isn't it? Obviously you've got the three major Marx Brothers, and you've got the three characters Dorothy meets on her journey. So how would you cast that?
Well, except the thing that jumped to my mind was really Groucho would have the Frank Morgan role. I mean,
Groucho should be Professor, yeah.
To play the Professor, and then the Wizard, Spoiler alert from 1939. It turns out the Wizard is the same character as the Professor. So that was just, Groucho has to be the Wizard. But you're right, that obviously the three... Well, Dorothy couldn't be Margaret Dumont, could she?
Lillian Roth.
There's no place like home. Yeah, Lillian Roth or Thelma Todd, perhaps. Depends what kind of story we're telling. But I don't know. It wouldn't actually be that off-brand for Groucho to be sort of separate. I mean, if Groucho were the wizard / Professor Marvel character, Professor Marvel, is that right? Or am I doing a Marvel thing because of you, Danny? I think it's Professor Marvel. That would kind of make sense for Groucho to be the separate figure of authority. I mean, it seems like the Scarecrow is Harpo's role because he's the most physically free of the characters.
Harpo has a cowardly lion quality too.
That's the one I always thought.
Okay. You see Harpo as the lion.
And we're going about Chico.
Well, I was going to say Chico doesn't seem to easily graft himself onto the Tin Man or the lion.
I think Chico would have been the straw man. I think
Zeppo would be the Tin Man. I mean, that's
absolutely. Yeah, he wouldn't even need makeup.
Yeah. This is a good idea. We should make this happen.
Although this would have probably meant no at the circus, so whatever.
Well, then we really should make it happen. What do you got next on your list, Danny?
What if Goldberg had lived, say, another 20 years? That Groucho, all of them, but certainly Groucho, I remember just always bemoaning that, he thought Goldberg had saved him commercially, and I guess he had. But then people tried to take that formula, but the only thing for the formula was Irving Goldberg himself.
Well, I think it's safe to say that he would have continued to make financially successful films, but I think it would have become more and more obvious that the best thing he did for the Marxes, at least for us fans looking backwards, is that he made sure that they had their top-notch writers. At least he did for opera and to a degree, A Day at the Races. Whether that would have continued, who knows? But I think everything else that we love about those first two films is a byproduct of them having great writers. So who knows how that would have gone going forward.
Matthew has made the point sometimes when the Thalberg question comes up that Thalberg doesn't seem to have been particularly interested in sequelism. He probably wouldn't have wanted to keep grinding out Marx Brothers movies for years, no matter how high quality they were. And so, it might be interesting to wonder what Irving Thalberg might have done with more time on Earth, but I'm not sure it would have involved the Marx Brothers.
Oh, but they were too much of a cash cow for Metro for them to just give them up.
Yeah, maybe they would have, like, if Thalberg had lived, maybe the vehicles they made later at MGM, at the circus, Go West, and the big store, maybe those would have been more prestige vehicles along the lines of Day at the Races, like still not up to the quality of Night at the Opera, but more.
Yeah, I think we would have got a lot more Day at the Races quality films.
Yeah.
Would he ever try to break the Marxes up as solo performers, or were they always considered just a brother act?
Well, I mean, Groucho was determined to prove himself as a solo. He didn't quite do that until, You Bet Your Life. But in film, he wasn't really able to do that. But you see him trying in Copacabana. And there's anomalies like the Story of Mankind, where each brother gets a scene without the others.
One thing that we've discussed several times here on the podcast is when Groucho made it obvious he didn't want to continue in the early 40s, we wonder if Chico and Harpo could have made it on their own as a brother act, either in features or shorts or whatever. It doesn't seem like they made any big attempt to do that. I can't imagine they couldn't have gotten one film made by somebody, but it doesn't look like they did. Perhaps they just were expecting Groucho to come back at some point and were biding their time waiting for him to come back, which he actually did for Night in Casablanca.
Or was Chico just content just traveling with a band leader?
Harpo and Chico performed live as a duo, in that period in the 1950s, quite a bit. Even billed as the Marx Brothers. They would be billed as the Marx Brothers, Harpo and Chico.
I'm sure they would have done it more had Harpo been up for it. Chico probably would have loved that as a full-time proposition.
Did anybody ever try to mold Harpo into the next Chaplin? That would seem like a natural.
Yeah, I think that's what Ben Hecht was trying to do with him on Love Happy. That was the idea.
Like in his prime, did anybody just look at Harpo?
Well, actually, yes. I think Alexander Woollcott did have that going on in his mind. Woollcott saw Harpo as the next Chaplin and wanted him to show more pathos. And in the tour of Russia that Harpo, did in 1933, he was working alone, and they did build a show around him. Harpo, in his book, writes about not knowing what this Russian drama was happening all around him, with a jealous husband and all kinds of stuff, characters running in and out of the scene. And then when cued, Harpo would come out and do the silverware routine or something and go over big. So I guess, Woollcott did kind of want Harpo to do that.
Mm-hmm.
One could easily see him having a Chaplin-esque career. It doesn't seem outside the realm of possibility.
I guess. I think, though, it's really hard to imagine, unless his character had been expanded in some way, deepened in some way, it's hard to imagine Harpo's character as a lone protagonist in a story, He's just not... He's not a striver. He's not a sympathetic. Chaplin was such a Dickensian, character. You identify with his plight right away. Now with Harpo, I think you identify with his urges. But he's not really a storytelling character in the way that Chaplin's Tramp was.
But I think with the right writers and directors, he probably could have been. But he'd have to want to do that.
Yeah. Right, you would need a more sympathy-inducing approach than anyone ever took with the Marx Brothers.
The appeal of them as brothers, I think, is so important in a way that maybe it's not the other teams called whatever brothers or sisters. It's something. I mean, there's that line, and I know Go West is not in the finest moments, but there's that line that I quote all the time: "You love your brother, don't you?" No, but I'm used to him.
Yeah.
There's something about them being literal brothers.
A great what if that we didn't bring up here is, yeah, what if these guys had hit the screen and they weren't brothers? They were just four performers who would evolve together, but they weren't related and there was no connection. Would they have been so successful if they'd just been?
I can't even compute that question because it's so it being brothers is so intrinsic.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the only, as you say that, the thing that comes to my mind is what if Groucho, George Burns, Jack Benny, and Eddie Cantor had formed a team? I mean, that they would be like the super group of comedy.
Yeah, right.
I guess the closest we ever have. Get ready for this analogy. Sonny and Cher, when they divorced, and then they tried to do the show to come back and do their show together after they were divorced. It had been a big hit before, and they broke up, and they each had tried to separate. In the individual show wasn't a big hit, so they said, "Okay, well, let's bring them back together." They're not married, but they're still together on stage, and the audience just didn't buy it.
Or, after Gracie Allen retired and George Burns did an act with Carol Channing for a while, it really was the Burns and Allen act, just Carol Channing instead of Gracie Allen. Same kind of material. Very disconcerting.
Yeah, it turned out he needed Walter Matthau more than... I mean, I guess that's why family acts are popular in general in vaudeville, and but these guys... And that goes back. That takes me back to the Corleones. There's something about the Marxes as brothers. They weren't a supergroup. They were. It kind of brings me to maybe my last. I think my last interesting what if Chico was better with money?
We'd have about 5 less films.
Yeah.
Right. No, but what would they have done instead?
I think that the act might have ended probably around 1940. Everything that did happen would have happened maybe 5 years earlier.
But the five fewer movies.
Or something like that, yeah.
Did they try to do TV? Or, did they try and fail and Groucho's on one who succeeded?
Chico tried a couple of series in the 50s that weren't bad, but they didn't succeed.
The Marx Brothers TV collection reveals that they all did more TV than we think they did, and Harpo, although he was never a regular on a series, he had a contract with NBC. He did specials and made a lot of variety show appearances. They were actually kind of ubiquitous on television for some years there. But not in a regular series, not the kind of success that Groucho had on You Bet Your Life. And that brings me to, I'll make this my final what if, which is, what if You Bet Your Life had not happened? When You Bet Your Life comes along, Groucho is kind of floundering, struggling to find a foothold on radio. He had been doing guest appearances on other people's radio shows. He's always amusing in those appearances, but there is a sense that he's slumming it, sort of trying to do the character we know from films and the stage, the character he'd been doing since 1921, but with a more disposable kind of radio gag writer type of material rather than the wonderful literary scripts that he had on film. Groucho just doesn't seem as brilliant, and it's strange to listen to some of those radio appearances where comedians who we think of as lesser comedians are actually, they score more than Groucho on those radio shows because it's more their element. You Bet Your Life comes along and gives him a chance to be conversational, partly spontaneous, and that was the perfect vehicle for him.
I mean, as we talked about earlier, the talk show hadn't really been invented yet, so I can't see him doing anything different than he had been in the 40s, doing guest appearances and occasional film and just hoping that something hit. The format that was best for him had to be invented to fit around him. It didn't really exist at the time.
There were obviously quiz shows before with personable hosts.
But they were more game focused. You Bet Your Life was designed to give him the freedom to basically ignore the game.
I think, like, without a star vehicle for himself in that period, Groucho would have remained a star of the past rather than a current star.
Yeah.
He would have remained a kind of nostalgia act, and he probably would have been more likely to go back to New York and do more stage work. We might have had a Groucho Broadway appearances in the 50s and 60s without You Bet Your Life. He also might have just written more books, stretched in other directions.
Who invented You Bet Your Life? Is that Alan Dwan?
Goodell, John Goodell.
So Goodell seeing that potential in Groucho really was the pivotal figure in this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he saw, he was present at the radio appearance with Bob Hope, where Groucho and Hope had ad-libbed to great effect, and supposedly that's the eureka moment for Goodell. Oh, Groucho should just be in spontaneous, unscripted conversation. That's how he really shines.
Maybe there's a parallel universe where Groucho is named the first host of the Tonight Show instead of Steve Allen.
Interesting, yeah.
Steve Allen was the Conan O'Brien or the David Letterman. I think a show like that probably needed some. I mean, there was a lot of Groucho in Steve Allen. I don't think you have Steve Allen without Groucho. But sort of combined with somebody who understood the TV medium.
Steve had one of the greatest lines. I just always think about this. Some ruckus was going on stage, and he goes, "Hey, another outburst like that, then I'll clear my throat." So, the 10-year-old me just couldn't stop laughing at that.
I have one more.
All right.
Yeah.
Right. The accepted wisdom is that Zeppo was, if not the funniest in real life, was certainly quite funny in real life. What if he was allowed to or able to bring that out? What would that have done to the Marx Brothers' lives and careers?
Well, it's funny when the what ifs about Zeppo in the act are discussed. One of the things we always say is that there wasn't room for him. Zeppo probably had the ability, but there was no room for another big comic personality in the act. And there was no incentive for the writers to create anything so great for Zeppo, since the writers weren't working for Zeppo the way they were working for the other brothers. So if Zeppo had been given more of a chance to be funny, it probably would have been due to the generosity of his brothers to welcome him in as an equal and say you're a partner, not just an employee, and and tell the writers, listen, we want Zeppo to have something funny to do. I guess that's all it really would have taken.
And I don't know if it was always like this, but certainly by the end, he didn't enjoy acting.
Yeah. That's the chicken and the egg, right? I mean, I wouldn't enjoy acting either if I were never given anything interesting to do.
Let me do the final one here. Okay.
Yeah.
Suppose after Animal Crackers, Margaret Dumont said, "This has been fun, but I'm done with you guys. Have a good career. I'll catch you guys on the line." Now, would they have found another Dahlweger to take her place, or would they just not have written that part in any future film?
Yeah, you could get Marie Dressler or somebody to play that part.
Okay, so you're saying they would have found somebody else like that?
Yeah, I think the answer is in their earlier career, because before they ever worked with Margaret Dumont, there were still characters like that. In Home Again, the character that Saba Shepard played was that kind of character, a dignified woman who Groucho insulted. And Groucho said in one of his later interviews, I always had a big lady to play with. He always said. So I think that tells us it's likely that they would have written those characters in simply because those are good characters to be foils for the Marx Brothers, especially Groucho. But I doubt anyone would have done it like Margaret Dumont.
Because I've always wondered about Duck Soup, the Mrs. Teasdale part. Maggie hadn't been in their last two films, and I wonder whether they wrote the part specifically for her, or whether they wrote the part hoping to get her, but would have been willing to go in a different direction had she not agreed to return.
Oh,
I think
I don't know. That's a good question.
What comes to mind is all those episodes of The Honeymooners, which had the same repertory company. The four main characters were always the four main characters, but then everybody else just had a different name every week. It would be the same exact players. I think the Marx Brothers maybe, as a preceding that, had in the audience's mind maybe had there was a stock company and Margaret Dumont was part of it. So would they have replaced her with somebody? And I think Margaret Dumont made their sleazy lines seem more acceptable. There's something about their verbal abuse of her, that her personality and her gravitas somehow made more acceptable than if they were really just shooting sleazy lines at more traditionally attractive women. I don't know. Something about it. Maybe she was the mother figure. I guess if they were these crazy, out of control brothers.
It's funny with all the films with Groucho and Maggie together, they never went so far as to have them actually married in a film. I would have loved to see them at least try that one time where they were married.
That's a good point. He never makes an honest woman out of her, does he?
Well, he does, at the end of Day at the Races. Marry me and I'll never look at another horse again. That's
Yeah, they tend to wind up together at the end. You get the sense that they will marry, but yeah, it's interesting. Certainly, the way she played that character was completely her own, and it's a very recognizable archetype that existed long before Margaret Dumont and long after her. But she didn't play it in a generic way. She played it in such a singular way,
but a consistent way.
Yeah.
Just like they were, no matter what their names in the movie were, they would go after Chico and Harpo, and she was always Maggie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this has been an exciting round of Marx Brothers What If?
Who won?
Well, I think the Fantastic Four, Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and Zeppo.
This was great fun. So I love that. What a great what if idea.
I didn't get to ask my one about Zeppo and Aaron having a kid together.
We're going to save that. Okay. That's going to be episode 73. Well, Danny, this has been an absolute pleasure.
Right back at you. Thank you for inviting me. This was great fun. And it's the dream of a lifetime I didn't even know I had to be on the Marx Brothers Council podcast.
Right back at you. And since you've listened to our show before, you know that we like to put our guests on the spot at the end of each episode as awkwardly as possible. Demand that they select our closing music.
Oh, wow. You know what? I should know that. I'm thinking it's either Everybody Works But Father or Father's Day, which let's do Father's Day, but the one with the background from the old radio one with the female background singers.
With the Ken Lane singers.
Yeah,
yes,
have a lot of people picked that?
I don't think anyone has.
Let's do that one. Let's do so edit out all this. You'll edit it out with the magic
okay.
computer.
Right.
But let's do.
Yeah, I'm gonna edit it out. Yeah, it's all gone.
Yeah, whatever. Okay. You'll be hearing from my counsel at Shyster Flywheel and Hunga Dunga. But let's do Father's Day.
Dear old dad, we love you so.
Dear old dad, we are glad to be here with you on this day of days, and we swear always that we will be here on this day each year. Today, Father, is Father's Day, and we're giving you a tie. It's not much we know, it's just our way of showing you we think you're a regular guy. You say that it was nice of us to bother, but it really was a pleasure to fuss. For according to our mother, you're our father, and that's good enough for us.
To
the tie that you got didn't cost such a lot, but we will give you the same tie next year.
You tell us it was nice of us to bother, but it really was a pleasure to fuss through.
For they say a child can only have one father, and you are the one for us. Yes, you are the one for us.
The Marx Brothers Council podcast is produced by Bob Cassell. Matthew Conium's books, including the annotated Marx Brothers, the annotated Abbott and Costello, and That's Me, Groucho, are published by McFarland. Noah Diamond's book, Give Me a Thrill, The Story of Alsatias, is published by Beer Manor Media. To leave a comment and for more info about this and all episodes, visit us at MarxBrothersCouncilPodcast.com. For the latest Marx Brothers and podcast news, follow us on X or Twitter, or both. And join the fun with the largest and most vibrant Marx community online, a club that will have someone like you as a member, the Marx Brothers Council Facebook group. That's it for now. Swordfish!
That's it, you guess it.
Hey, you want to hear my Stan Lee story?
Sure.
So we're driving our kid up to school at Ithaca, and we stopped at there's a White Castle in Nanuet, New York. And up on the wall, there's a picture of this older guy eating some White Castles. And I do double take, it's Stan Lee eating White Castle.
Stan Lee is a member of the White Castle Hall of Fame.
Oh, he is? Really?
You know, Stan would go anywhere for publicity or, whether fun or publicity. It does track historically that he was a kid in the Bronx and Washington Heights when they opened the first White Castles in New York.
Yeah.
And he claims that he loved it and went to them.
Okay.
I have no idea. It's possible, but I have no idea. I doubt. but yeah, there's a video of him accepting, as if it was the Academy, like an honorary Academy Award, accepting being in the White Castle Hall of Fame.